Okay, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to Big Tent. It's been a pretty eventful year so far. Back in December, when we invited Crew to speak to us, we had no idea what early January would be. So far, we've had an attempted overthrow of our election, a violent coup attempt, and a second impeachment of Donald Trump with 10 Republicans voting to impeach. But Noah Bookbinder and Donald Sherman have been working to hold the administration to account for years. They filed complaints with the IRS about the Trump Foundation. They sued Trump for violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. They filed complaints about Hatch Act violations. They requested an investigation into Jared Kushner's disclosure omissions. They worked to help get rid of unethical cabinet secretaries, et cetera, et cetera. And more recently, they filed a criminal complaint against Donald Trump's pressuring of the Georgia Secretary of State, and they have launched an investigation into Trump's delayed response to the armed insurrection. So in other words, they've been doing all the work of exposing the ongoing criminality of the Trump family and the Trump administration. And now they'll be leading the charge to hold all of them accountable for their criminal behavior. So we owe Noah and Donald and their entire team huge thanks and are grateful to have them with us here tonight. Wendy Rogovin, our Big Tent resident lawyer, will moderate the Q&A. So please put your questions into the chat box, and we will put a donation link in the chat too, in case you're inspired to support this essential organization. We'll send that out to you tomorrow also. Noah and Donald, over to you.
Thanks, Sue. First of all, thanks so much for inviting us to join you all here today. It's really at such a dark time, although today was a little bit brighter. It's really good to be in the company of people who understand the kinds of things that need to be done and who care deeply. And thank you also to you, Sue. Your and Steve's support for Crew is such a huge part of enabling us to do what we do, and your introduction of us to so many others who care also. So thank you. When you first invited us to come, I was thinking this was not that long ago, it was a month or so ago, that I would sort of need to make the argument for why preserving the democracy is still a priority going forward. Obviously, a lot has happened between then and now, and I don't think there's a lot of doubt that that is something that has to be a priority for all of us. And I'll get into some of the work that Crew has done and is planning to do going forward. I'll start with a quick introduction of, sort of who I am and who the organization is and who Donald is. So I'm Noah Bookbinder. I was a long time ago, I was a federal corruption prosecutor out of the Department of Justice. I worked for a lot of years as a counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then worked on federal sentencing policy for a number of years. And I came to Crew in 2015, which was in many ways a very different era than the one we're living in right now. Crew goes all the way back to 2003, to the days of people like Tom DeLay and Jack Abramoff, the sort of last ethics crisis, which seems positively quaint by comparison to where we've been in recent years. But Crew is an organization that uses an expert legal team, a really thorough and skilled research team, and a very talented communications team to promote ethics in government, fight corruption, and fight for democracy. We are a nonpartisan organization. We have a bipartisan board with leading experts. The chair of our board is former White House counsel Beth Nolan. Senator Claire McCaskill is on our board. Some prominent Republicans like former Congresswoman Claudine Schneider, former independent Republican presidential candidate Evan McMullin. And we obviously have been focused for the past 4+ years on this level of corruption and anti-democratic abuses that I think none of us thought we would ever see. It's now obvious to us that the fight to preserve our democratic institutions and to rebuild an ethical government, far from being over, is really just getting going, and it's more important than it's ever been. So I'm going to start with just a brief look back at some of the work that Crew has done over the past few years, some of which you mentioned in your very kind introductory remarks, Sue. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we are doing in this current crisis of democracy that we're living in today, and then on what our focus is going forward as we seek to rebuild. And I will also mention as you said, our deputy director, Donald Sherman, is on the call as well. Donald has been a leader on oversight and ethics issues in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and in the executive branch. We're really, really lucky to have him at Crew. And in our discussion, you'll hear from me first, but in our discussion with questions, you can hear the even better version from Donald. So Crew was focused on President Donald Trump's corruption from well before he was inaugurated in January of 2017. And that prepared us to be ready to, on President Trump's first day in the Oval Office, file the first lawsuit that anyone has ever brought against a president, or anyone else for that matter, for systematic violations of the emoluments clauses of the Constitution. Crew brought that initial lawsuit itself, and a few months later, we added to that lawsuit competitors to the president, and we also joined with the attorneys general for Maryland and Washington, D.C., to bring another lawsuit for violations of the emoluments clauses. And with those lawsuits, we really launched the narrative that this was a corrupt presidency, that this was a president who every day that he was on the job was going to be using the presidency to enrich himself, including from foreign governments and the federal and state governments here in the United States, and was going to be putting himself in a position every day where his own financial interests would compete with the interests of the American people. Those lawsuits, which were breaking entirely new ground, were in many ways very successful. Both lawsuits are actually still around. They have survived repeated attacks from the president. They're actually both before the Supreme Court right now. But in many ways, they were successful from day one because they started people thinking about and talking about the ways that this president was corrupting the presidency. And we continued to focus on the president's corrupt use of the government and the presidency every day for the past 4 years. There were times when we were able to turn back some of the most craven examples of corruption. It was I think in large part our furious push with legal complaints and op-eds and press comments that led to a quick reversal on the decision that President Trump made to bring the G7 Conference of Nations to his Doral resort. And then there were a lot of times where we've just recorded and shined a light on this constant corruption. We have on our website a live tracker of every publicly known instance of conflicts of interest between the presidency and Donald Trump's businesses. We're now at more than 3,700 conflicts of interest over the past 4 years. And we were able this fall to make that issue of constant corruption really a part of, we're not an electoral organization, but really a part of the closing argument as people looked at this presidency. So we put out a major report summarizing just the vast expanse of corruption that we had seen through the president's properties. And that translated into huge editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post, really going through all of Crew's work in highlighting conflict of interest and why they were a problem, really responding to the arguments that we had framed. And it led to writing from people like conservative columnist Max Boot, who's been deeply opposed to President Trump, and has been noticed in outlets that get far beyond people who read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Donald worked on a piece on the president's corruption in Blavity, which is a website that reaches younger, primarily African American audience. And so we have really, we're working every day to get that story of corruption out. At the same time, we were focused for 4 years on the president's anti-democratic abuses, from firing of inspectors general who were looking into issues that he thought would be damaging to him, and to favorite cabinet officials, to leading the push for the initial impeachment, for obstruction of justice, and then for the president's pressuring of Ukraine to announce an investigation into Joe Biden. But I wanted to focus, I wanted to flag a particular area that we focused on, which was the systematic co-opting of the government for the purpose of getting Donald Trump reelected, which was something that was a factor that characterized years of this administration, which included things like using national parks as backdrops for campaign events. It included misuse of the postal service to undermine voting by mail, and these constant violations of the Hatch Act, which says that government officials can't use their positions for politics. Not many people had heard of the Hatch Act before Crew started talking about it constantly, but we ended up filing dozens of complaints for violations of the Hatch Act. And ultimately, the office that administers the Hatch Act, which is an office run by a longtime Republican, a Trump appointee, found violations in response to 15 complaints that Crew had brought, including recommending that Kellyanne Conway be fired for repeated violations, reaching similar findings for White House advisor Peter Navarro. And we were able to help push to make that a huge story, first during the Republican National Convention, which was essentially a week-long Hatch Act violation. And that became kind of the lead story for one of the nights in media outlets throughout the country, to making that become a huge story again right before the election. There was a finding in the immediate run-up to the election that Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue had violated the Hatch Act and he had to repay the government. There was a huge piece in the Washington Post about this co-opting of the government to get the president reelected. A major report from Senator Warren, pulling largely from Crew's work. And one of the things that was really interesting was, again, it wasn't just the Washington Post and the New York Times that were reporting on this, because of the really creative outreach from our communications folks. When, in response to one of our complaints, Agriculture Secretary Perdue was found to have violated the Hatch Act, it was covered by a large number of farm publications, publications like Feed Strategy, which was not a publication I was previously familiar with, but it really meant that this corruption reached a really different and much broader audience. There's so much more I could talk about the last 4 years of work, but I want to kind of fast forward to the current crisis. You know, Crew has been making the point, not just since the election, but even before the election, that the president, in questioning the integrity of the election, in suggesting first that it would be stolen and then that it was stolen, when it was an election that he ultimately clearly lost, that was an assault on democracy and that it was incredibly dangerous. It was something that was initially, I think, hard to get a lot of people to um, take seriously, but obviously, has become more and more of a threat and exploded in the horrific attacks last week. We started pushing back against this, not just by making a lot of comments and writing a lot of things, but we aggressively called out the administrator of the General Services Administration, Emily Murphy, who we were able to prove really uh, went against all precedent and history and law in refusing for weeks to acknowledge President-elect Biden's victory and to start the transition, which was dangerous for national security and also for people's faith in democracy. We called for Senator Lindsey Graham to be removed from the Senate Judiciary Committee when he suggested that votes in Georgia should be, when he actually suggested to the Georgia Secretary of State that thousands of votes should be thrown out, legitimate votes. We came out very strongly in the response to the president's really shocking and anti-democratic pardons. We were quoted in a lot of the stories about that, helping to frame that as again, an attack on the democracy, when the president was sending the signal that those who protected him, including protecting him from investigations of anti-democratic abuses, would not have to experience the justice system in the way that a lot of people who were not wealthy, white, close allies of Donald Trump have had to experience the justice system. Then when it came out, a couple of weeks ago, that the president had called the Georgia Secretary of State and asked him to find more than 11,000 votes, we actually came out several days before the insurrection of last week, calling for a second impeachment based on the fact that there was now incontrovertible proof of Donald Trump trying to rig the election. And we also called on both the Justice Department and the Fulton County District Attorney in Georgia to criminally investigate the president for election fraud and civil rights offenses in trying to strip thousands of Americans of their right to vote. When the attack happened, obviously, like everybody else, it took sort of a moment to process what was happening. It wasn't a thing we had ever seen in the United States, but our team worked to get out very, very quickly to help to frame what people were seeing at a time when it still wasn't entirely clear whether these were just sort of exuberant protesters or something more sinister, to make clear that President Trump had shown himself to be an enemy of democracy, that this was an attack on America, and that, as we said Wednesday night, and then in an op-ed the following morning, that he had to be impeached, removed, and prohibited from holding further office in the United States, because getting him out is not enough. The risk posed by the fact that he could be running for president again within a week is not a tolerable risk. And, we put that out right from the beginning. We also, it was an op-ed that I had sort of making that case Wednesday morning, and later that day, Donald had an op-ed making the case that it was essential that there be accountability for those members of Congress who contributed to inciting this insurrection, everyone from Senator Josh Hawley and Senator Ted Cruz on down. We followed that up, as we often do, with really thoroughly researched and kind of well-supported legal action. We filed a couple of days ago a complaint to the Department of Justice and the FBI, making the case for why they had to open an investigation into President Trump for seditious conspiracy. That is the sedition statute in federal law. And actually, the following day, the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia announced that that office was starting an investigation into sedition and conspiracy related to the attacks of last week. We also, when people like Betsy DeVos and Elaine Chao resigned, they were initially getting some sort of dubious credit for leaving in a principled way. Crew was quick to point out that in leaving, they were actually bucking their responsibility to do something about Donald Trump under the 25th Amendment, which is something that was picked up soon by senators and people like Rachel Maddow. We're going to keep the pressure on. It is, there was a huge victory today with a bipartisan vote for impeachment of President Trump, but that has to be just the beginning. And so we are going to be out there pushing for President Trump to be convicted, for him to be banned from future federal office, which can happen if he is convicted, but that's a separate vote that Congress has to hold. I had an op-ed out today making the case that he has to be held accountable through his businesses, that every corporation and foreign government and organization that has an event at one of his businesses needs to be accountable for doing that. And we're gonna hold members of Congress accountable. We're gonna be out there pushing for follow through, for accountability, for justice, for this really appalling attack. But of course, the work that we're going to be doing going forward is much broader than that. I know I don't want to take too much time, but I want to give a quick summary of what our focuses are going to be going forward. And there are three pieces to highlight. The first is reform, that it is now clear that we need stronger laws, better rules, and a change in culture to prevent attacks on the democracy, to prevent pervasive corruption, and to have a strong community a strong democracy going forward. We've been thinking for years on watching what Donald Trump does and figuring out where the gaps in the law are, as well as thinking about issues that predated Donald Trump, like the excessive influence of money in politics. So I think it's now clear, given recent events, that there's going to be support for reform. There's likely to be some legislation passed, but what we need is sweeping reform. So we worked with a lot of other organizations and with Congress on the legislation that was introduced 2 years ago and just reintroduced as H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which I think really has a shot of passing in some form. And we're going to be pushing hard for that, but we need more than that. That's a law that works on reducing the influence of money in politics, on building up voting rights, on building up ethics protections. We've also worked on several other important pieces of legislation that have been introduced. And one thing that we did in late last year is publish a really sweeping report, this report we call What Democracy Looks Like, which sets out in, I think it's about I think it's about 170 pages, all of the reforms that are needed, we think, to really have a strong democracy. And that's going to be a blueprint, and we're going to be pushing to see as many pieces of that translated into reality as possible. Even with the events of the last week, we need to make the case that real reform, that there's a connection between the events that people have seen that are horrifying and the need for changes in the law. And that's something that's going to be a huge focus for Crew. Related to that is going to be a push for real accountability for the abuses of the Trump administration. And that means not just for last week's attack, although there needs, of course, to be accountability for that, but for 4 years of corruption and 4 years of anti-democratic actions, which is all related. That pervasive corruption, that and pervasive chipping away at checks and balances contributed to the reality of having a president who thought that his own interest and his own power took priority over everything else, over the votes of the American people and the interests of the American people. And I think without those 4 years of corruption, we wouldn't have gotten to the really scary place we've gotten to. Even with that, there's a lot of pressure, I think, on the new incoming administration and the new Congress to maybe do something quick. They already did something quick today, and move on. And sort of, there are other important issues to get to. There's sort of a push for unity, but I think it's going to be really crucial for us and for all of you to make the case that accountability is crucial. It's not about revenge. It's that we need to know what the truth was. We need to know what happened, so that we can restore people's faith in government, that people are not going to believe that their government is honest and worthy of their trust if people were able to abuse it so egregiously with no consequence. There also needs to be deterrence for those who would take these kinds of actions in the future. And there needs to be accountability and an accounting of what happened in order to make the case for the kind of reform that we need. So some of that is going to be Crew helping to drive accountability ourselves. We're going to keep on digging through use of things like the Freedom of Information Act, which we use a lot, to find out what happened. We just today uncovered emails showing that the Interior Department pressured career employees to tweet pro-Trump propaganda, essentially. And we're going to keep on making those kinds of discoveries and pushing them out. We're going to keep filing complaints to get enforcement agencies to take action. We're also going to be pushing, both in cooperation and also sometimes with public pressure, for Congress to take action, for congressional hearings, for congressional investigations and findings, and also for prosecutions, for state and federal prosecutions. We're going to keep filing those criminal complaints, keep reaching out on that. And I think a part that's really important, not instead of those pieces, but in addition, is some kind of a national, hopefully bipartisan commission to look into the abuses of the Trump administration, to really help to get the big picture of what happened and what needs to change. So we're going to continue making that case. It's my prediction that within weeks, if not days, you'll hear people in Congress and in the media saying that they're tired of hearing about Donald Trump's abuses and it's time to move on. And that's really, really dangerous. And it's going to be our job to fight that fatigue and make the case for why we got to keep going. One final piece is that we will also be looking for accountability for the government that we will have, the new administration and the new Congress. We have every expectation that the Biden administration will be a far cry from the Trump administration on ethics and corruption. But we know that there need to be high standards, and they need to be held to high standards to restore people's faith in democracy. I think we're very hopeful that when there are slips, that we can point them out, and that people will willingly change their behavior, that'll be much more of a reality than it has been in quite some time now. But we may need to sometimes call people out with consequences and complaints when necessary, and we're going to do that because we need to demand high standards from the government. So that's a summary. We have hit the ground running this year. Obviously, none of us had the luxury of taking a break, but the work's just getting started. And it's going to be, this year is going to be absolutely crucial in getting to the accountability and the reform that we need to ensure the future of our democracy. So I will say thank you again to all of you for your interest in everything you've been doing for our democracy and in having me here. And with that, I'll stop, and Donald and I are happy to take questions and have a discussion.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions that have been pouring in, and I'm going to ask you one off the top before I get to anyone else's. With respect to preserving democracy, what do you say to people who have difficulty drawing a line between white supremacists and Nazis on the one hand, and Black Lives Matter and people protesting disability, rights protesters on the other hand? What do you say until we can understand the line between these groups, which seems pretty clear to me? I think we have a problem going forward protecting democracy.
So I have a quick answer, and I think Donald may have some thoughts on this as well. So I'll give it a quick try and then pitch it over to Donald. But I think that one of the things that we saw last week was a set of people who really can't be called protesters. I think you have to call them something like insurrectionists is the term we've been using. People who believe that there should only be a democratic election, or that we should only defer to the results of a democratic election if they win it, but that there is no, they have no regard for or attachment to the principle of democracy. And I think that is a fundamental difference between that group of insurrectionists, and the people we saw protesting this summer, where even for people who thought that some of the tactics became too violent or too extreme, that was a group of people who was protesting for more representation, more voting, more democracy. And so I think that is a really a fundamental divide. Donald, you may have much deeper thoughts on that than I do.
I have some deeper thoughts, but I guess I will, I will echo what, part of what you said, Noah, which is, at bottom, I think I'll talk about the interpretation as opposed to the substance. And I think one of our challenges is that there are people, and a sizable minority, that just don't believe in facts. And one of the essential roles that Crew plays and has played is really being on the front lines in the fight for facts, right? That is what we do with our Freedom of Information Act litigation. That is how we have exposed corruption and, really enabled members of Congress and, members of the media to use those facts to help change minds. And one of the ways that we do that is, as Noah alluded to earlier, obviously we have a great ability with our social media and relationships with traditional media, but we don't rest on our laurels. Noah's been published in the New York Times more than anybody that runs a good government organization that I am aware of. But we're not satisfied with that. And one of the things that we worked really hard to do over the last few years is to reach communities and to engage in conversation outside the Beltway, outside of the East Coast media market. I'm from New York, so I'm always biased towards New York, but getting outside of the Mid Atlantic with our message, explaining why issues of ethics and corruption impact the kitchen table issues, and presenting facts to people where they live. And so, we've published op-eds in the Albuquerque Journal, in the Oklahoman, in the Kansas City Star. No, was published today in the Daily News, which is sort of the local New York paper, as I'm sure y'all know. And I think that's one of the ways that we work to sort of bridge this divide with respect to facts, right? We're creative with our litigation so that we can get access to the information that is needed to help bring to light distinctions between, say, Black Lives Matter and insurrectionists trying to overturn an election. But we also use our media team really creatively, not just to reach influence makers in Washington, but also to get people where they live. And I think you have to take that kind of multifaceted approach in order to really move the needle. Obviously, we're not going to reach everybody in a post-fact reality, but I think we have to try. And I think we do a really good job of that through multiple platforms.
Yes, indeed. Um, Switching over to another topic, can you address the issue of the Trump administration's practice of firing the the IGs? It seems like this practice renders the IG unable to function, but possibly could be fixed with a simple change to the IG law.
Sure. So as folks may know, every department and actually a lot of the smaller agencies in the government have an inspector general who is supposed to be an independent watchdog to look into wrongdoing, look into waste, fraud, and abuse and illegality. Inspectors general are carried forward into new administrations. They're not supposed to be political, and they're not supposed to be fired for political reasons. They're only supposed to be fired if they, if they screw up in doing their job. Donald Trump fired several inspectors general. He fired the inspector general for the intelligence community, who was the one who notified Congress about the Ukraine phone call that led to the first impeachment, and others. He also found ways to push out career people who were acting inspectors general where there hadn't been permanent ones. And it is that is one of the areas where it turns out that the law was not as strong as we thought it was. The law essentially said, if you're going to fire an inspector general, you got to tell Congress why. And Donald Trump would essentially say, I fired this inspector general because I no longer had faith in this person. And that was about it. And, that's actually one of the laws one of the bills that Crew worked on with a number of organizations was one called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which would build in real protections that both put in substantive requirements for when an inspector general can and cannot be fired, but also a procedure so that an inspector general can go to court to challenge a firing. So that is something, again, which had been largely working because presidents of both parties operated in good faith. And it turns out that when you had a president who wasn't operating in good faith, there was a gap in the law that he could drive a truck through.
So what happens to the current cases that you have, and what happens to them if Trump is pardoned? Is there will the pardons affect your cases? If so, how?
So there are a lot of different kinds of cases. I'll give an answer, and Donald, if you have more thoughts, definitely jump in. it's we, some of our cases are maybe limited when Donald Trump leaves office. The goal of our emoluments clause lawsuits has been to stop the violations from happening, and that they will stop come next week. And there are other cases. We have a lot of cases on information that we're looking for under the Freedom of Information Act. There are cases challenging destruction and loss of records, including the records of families that were split up at the border, and records that Donald Trump and those who work for him have destroyed in a lot of different ways. Those lawsuits are going to keep going. Those are civil lawsuits, so they won't be affected by pardons. We've also brought a lot of criminal complaints asking for investigations into Donald Trump and a whole lot of people around him, from his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to cabinet officials, to members of Congress and others. Some of those, if there are sweeping blanket pardons, some of those criminal investigations are going to be undercut. But not, but there are other ways of getting accountability. First of all, we believe that Donald Trump cannot legally pardon himself. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if he tries next week. But I'm skeptical that that's going to hold up in a court of law. And for other people, there can be state investigations, which are not affected by federal pardons. There can be congressional investigations where people are hauled in and forced to answer for their actions, and scathing reports, which obviously is not the same as going to prison. But there are lots of ways to hold people accountable, and we're going to try to make sure that those are used, even if there are pardons.
So one of the things that we do particularly well is try and see around corners, anticipate problems. I think case in point, as Noah mentioned, when we filed our complaints, our criminal complaints against President Trump for the Georgia call, we filed not just with the Department of Justice, but also with the Fulton County District Attorney in Atlanta. Because, as Noah said, Trump can't pardon himself out of a local investigation, and there were crimes committed under state law. And so, we try and anticipate what folks are going to do to try and wriggle out of these things, and we try and prepare for that. Folks like Pompeo, folks like other folks who Nikki Haley, who have potential presidential aspirations in 2024 or beyond. We are continuing to push for agencies to review those complaints and hold them accountable, because we think it's important that there's accountability, whether they're in office, out of office, or seeking future office. So we try and think a couple of steps ahead so that we have multiple avenues for accountability.
What entity has legal standing to challenge Trump's pardoning of himself or his children?
So I think the way that would work, I mean, it's an interesting question because it's never happened before. So we, as with things like emoluments clause lawsuits, like we're all going to be sort of making this up as we go a little bit. But I think what would happen is that if a federal prosecutor wanted to bring a case against Donald Trump for something he did while he was president, and Donald Trump had pardoned himself, I think what would happen is the federal prosecutor would bring the charges anyway. And then Donald Trump would go to the court where those charges were brought and say, you can't charge me because I was pardoned. And then that judge, and it might go up on appeals, would have to decide if that was a valid pardon. I think that's how it would work. I can't swear to it, as I said, because this is uncharted territory.
So I was wondering if you could address in a little more detail how the members of Congress like Hawley and Cruz and Brooks can be held accountable. What what's realistic and what do you foresee happening?
Donald, do you want to take that one as our congressional ethics expert?
Sure. So just by way of background, my first job in on the Hill was with the House Ethics Committee, and so even here we've seen a lot of movement on obviously the horrific events of last Wednesday happened. Noah published an op-ed about the need for to hold President Trump accountable in USA Today that morning. I published an op-ed about the members of Congress in the Daily Beast that afternoon. And what we saw in the days since were senators started to contemplate something that they never do, which is to file complaints against members of their own body with the Senate Ethics Committee or introduce resolutions to expel Hawley and Cruz if they don't resign. Now, it's a pretty high bar on the Senate Ethics Committee, in part because the Senate Ethics Committee is incredibly permissive. And even though if a member is expelled, they're expelled for a single Congress and can run again. I think it's a pretty high bar, but one of the things we do is obviously we do public facing work, but we also work behind the scenes. And so I spoke with folks in a senator's office this morning about a complaint that they're drafting against Senators Hawley and Cruz to compel some kind of sanction against them from the Ethics Committee, whether it's censure or expulsion. Now, the likelihood of that happening depends on a number of different factors, right? It depends on the level of outrage after January 20th about the conduct, whether once Trump is out of office, people feel more compelled to find their backbone and stand up against some of these folks, especially because obviously Hawley and Cruz don't have the same cult-like following as Donald Trump, and they can sort of untether it. It's a long shot, but Crew is about long shots, right? People really couldn't conceive of using the emoluments clause ever to hold the president accountable. And, that was a lawsuit that we conceived on the president's first day in the Oval Office. And so, some of those meet with, sometimes we get pushback, sometimes we get, get the exact end result that we desire. And sometimes we get something in the middle. Who knows what's going to happen with Hawley, but the fact that his colleagues are turning against him is something that really could not have been conceived before last week. And we're going to keep pushing both behind the scenes and publicly to make sure that those folks in the Senate and also the folks in the House like Gomert and others are investigated. And we may have some more public things to say about that over the next week or so.
So I have a question that started with Diana Revson raised it, and then Dominique Browning followed up with it. And it's how do we deal with the cult of Trump, and that the big lie seems to work for these people, and we're witnessing is a mass psychosis of sorts, a mass delusion. Rational argument doesn't seem to reach people who are under this sway. What does work, and how do we deal with this?
It's a really good question. It's a question that I think we've been struggling with for 4+ years. I guess I can say a few things to that. One is that while we have tried very, very hard to reach out past the audiences that are going to be sympathetic to us coming in, we also recognize that there's a segment of the population that we may never be able to get to. There is, whether it is 20%, 30% of the population that is going to stick with Donald Trump no matter what. And maybe there are ways to break that hold, but that Cruz sort of mastery of facts and arguments, may not be enough to break through that. But we have really targeted in a very sharp way both the sort of persuadable one-time Trump supporters in, kind of in the middle, and also those people who maybe weren't paying attention and weren't engaged one way or another. And that has been, there have been a couple of ways to do that. One is by getting our case out in all sorts of different mediums, getting on local network news all over the country, getting picked up, as Donald said, by local papers everywhere from Milwaukee to Albuquerque, getting to publications and websites that reach African American and Latino audiences, getting into farm publications, and sort of meeting people where they live. Another piece of it is kind of just the regular, making sure that stories of corruption are coming out day after day after day, so that when you get years in, people have just kind of internalized the idea that this guy is corrupt, and he everything he does is going to be corrupt, and that that happened. I mean, it didn't move. We didn't move 40% of the population, but we may have moved 5 or 10% of the population, and that makes an enormous difference. I think, though, what we've seen through the really horrific events of last week, and we have, as Donald said, and as I said, we've really tried hard to kind of help to frame that and help people to see what it is that really happened. Maybe to some extent the spell has been broken, that members of Congress and corporations and at least certain types of supporters who stuck with Donald Trump through abuse after abuse after abuse thought that this was both so outrageous and also looked so bad that they had to cut ties. And once people, I think, saw that you could do that and maybe survive politically and survive in society, that empowers others to do that. And I hope that will relegate Donald Trump. It's not going to destroy the cult of Trump, but it may relegate him to his core cult followers. I'm not going to assume that's done and that's happening. It's going to take a lot of work to make sure that happens, but I think there's at least a shot of it.
One of the people on the call, Marsha Mori, who's a representative in North Carolina. Marsha, are you there? She had a question that relates to this. Not sure. I think she's, sorry, I was trying to, let me ask the question. She had submitted it before. It's following up on the same point, and it basically that a lot of people like to say this is not who we are, but the reality is this is who we are because this is what's happening. And the question that she had is, given that she's in the state Senate or state House and has to face her Republican colleagues, won't wear masks, have huge Trump photos on their walls and rallies in Pennsylvania with signs that say "Stop the Steal." How does she begin to communicate with these legislators who are still in power? Is there a different approach that you can take within a legislative body?
It's a really good question. I think one thing that comes to mind for me, and Donald, I'm going to see if you have other thoughts on this too after this. I think one thing that is clear after last week is that Donald Trump incited an attack on the legislative branch of the United States, including Democrats and Republicans. From everything I understand, they pretty much all thought their lives were potentially at risk. And so that may be a place to start. In other words, that this is a president who has contempt for everybody in government apart from himself, and including legislators of all stripes. And sort of, this is not your friend. And I'm not. I will preface or I will add that I don't fully know the answer because we like everybody else have been trying to find ways to talk to Trump supporters. I think that's one. I think another is that some of these issues of um, self-dealing and conflicts of interest, issues of corporate influence, um, issues of sort of co-opting the government for political gain, result in policies that are really bad for regular people. Certainly terrible for African American communities and Latino communities, but also really terrible for rural communities and people who work in factories and those are the voters for a lot of these legislators. Donald, do you have other thoughts on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think reasonable expectations is the first key, but I think you have to start at sort of the two poles, right? And what Noah said is important because I think one common value that most folks can agree upon is the importance of loyalty, right? Whether it's in friend relationships, whether it's in familial relationships, spouses, whatever, right? Like everybody has some concept of some relationship where there is loyalty and trust. And I think talking about the ways that Trump has been affirmatively disloyal to even his closest allies, right? Without forgiving those folks, but he's turned on Bill Barr, he turned on Jeff Sessions, he turned like all of these people that were sort of the right hand person of Trump. He turned on Pence so much that his supporters wanted to kill him, right? Like I think disloyalty is something that resonates with people because they can identify that in their own lives. And I think the other thing is to if there is some policy that their colleagues don't like, that you can tie to Trump in some way. And obviously that requires a little bit more forensics and more relationship building. But I think one of the things that we've done is we've identified a number of policies that the administration has implemented that directly benefit Trump's business. In addition to our conflicts report with 3,700 conflicts of interest over 4 years, and so I think not just starting with common values is one strategy, but also starting with something that someone has an equally passionate distaste for, and sort of pulling Trump into that may be another strategy.
Thank you. So we were going to stop at 8, and Noah and Donald kindly offered to stay on a little bit longer if we have more questions, and we do. But for those of you who want to hop off, please feel free to do so. And I just also to point out in the chat is support for a link for you to support Crew's work. So are you all able to stay for a few more minutes, Noah and Donald?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So we have a couple of questions that relate to, I guess, what's going on again in Congress and the Republicans who supposedly or who are getting death threats or felt they couldn't vote for impeachment because they feared for their life or that of their families. What do you do with that? I mean, I know you had just said that terror doesn't discriminate. And this is Dominic Browning's point again. I think we're starting to see more of what's really going on here. It's not just political, it's not just ideological, it's also kind of mobbed up. So,
I mean, I don't want to sound unsympathetic because obviously, these threats are real. I mean, these are violent extremists who have killed and are very capable of doing that. At the same time, the threats are um, the threats are directed in a lot of different directions. I mean, in other words, there are plenty of people who voted for uh, impeachment who have been the subject of all kinds of threats. I guarantee you that the insurrectionists are not, fond of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she didn't have trouble making that vote. It is that at some point, um, people who run for office have to be willing and able to follow some kinds of principles. Again, I don't say that with any disregard for the enormous personal sacrifice of a lot of these members of both parties who feel personally threatened. But if we have members of Congress who cannot vote the way they want to vote because they're too scared, then we no longer have a democracy. That is so. I think that members have to find it within themselves to go to the FBI, go to the Capitol Police, or the Secret Service. It wouldn't have the protection duties, but might have some jurisdiction, to report threats and request protection, and then do the right thing. That it cannot be an excuse that I cannot vote the right way because it's too dangerous. If that's the case, we need to shut down the whole operation. And I know that's not a particularly satisfying answer, but I think it has to be the answer.
David Weisbrod asks if there are any actions vis-a-vis the Republican Party that could be considered given the astonishing anti-democratic positions that they're taking.
We have, crew. I guess I'll give two answers. One is that we have, in public statements and writing, we have been very clear in saying that the fact that a major political party is willing to come out for overturning the result of a democratic election is appalling and wrong and deeply threatening to the democracy. In terms of things like legal action, like complaints, we are pretty strict in sort of looking where the law is and looking where the facts are. And that doesn't mean we only look at elected officials. We've filed complaints, now a couple of complaints against Rudy Giuliani. We've gone after a lot of different dark money groups that operate in illegal ways. I'm not aware of, at the moment, a complaint that we're looking into the Republican Party on a legal basis, but we certainly have been very strong about their, the sort of anti-democratic positions that they are taking.
And looking forward, perhaps we can try to focus on some things that are not quite as dark, but what do you foresee what crew will be doing in the Biden administration? Will you be holding people to task just as strongly?
I sure as hell hope there's not a reason to hold people to task as strongly, because if there is, then things will have gone very, very wrong. But we are going to have the same kinds of high standards, and so when if people violate the Hatch Act, if people have conflicts of interest, we will call them on it. I expect that it'll happen less frequently, and that's not a partisan thing. That is just the difference between an administration of well-intentioned professionals and an administration of criminals, essentially. So I certainly expect that. I also expect that when people, when there are problems, that, I will say that there were two Obama administration cabinet officials who had ran into Hatch Act problems. And when that happened, the reaction was pretty swift, that they apologized and said it will not happen again. And the White House said that this is not acceptable and it can't happen again. We expect to see that kind of reaction more often. So we will certainly call people on violations, but I'm hopeful that that will be met constructively as a sort of, oh my goodness, we can't do that. We have to change for the better. I expect we will be spending a lot of time with the Biden administration working on policy changes to make the government more ethical, more democratic, less corrupt, more transparent. That's the part that I'm looking forward to.
Have you found, Mary Himes asked, have you found bipartisan support for the new laws that will protect our democracy?
I will say that I'll share an anecdote, which is that I worked for all the way back to my days as a counsel in the Senate Judiciary Committee. I worked on legislation to strengthen criminal corruption laws, which the Supreme Court for many years has made weaker and weaker. And there was a piece of legislation that I worked on that was introduced a couple of times as a bipartisan legislation. It had Democratic co-sponsors and Republican co-sponsors. And in 2017, I called a counsel for one of the senators who had been a Republican co-sponsor of that bill for years and said, hey, how about coming back with this corruption law? And this attorney, is a person that I like and respect, said, oh, we can't do corruption issues while Trump is president. And that is an honest to God conversation that happened. So the short answer is, during the Trump administration, there has been little to no support for ethics reform, corruption reform, voting rights reform from Republicans, because they felt like they could not, that it would be seen as anti-Trump to work on those issues. We have gotten plenty of support from outside, from Republicans who are disgusted with the Trump administration, and they have been part of the coalition. I am hopeful, although I think it's going to be a slog and a long effort, that starting next week, we will start to see Republicans. We've already heard on things like legislation to strengthen corruption laws that actually maybe Republicans might be starting to be interested again. Even if it's because they want to go after, the Biden administration, like, I'll take it, because it is the way to prevent a next Trump administration. And I think there will be more of that. We're going to be working to cultivate it, but it's going to be a slog.
I have one last question, which is also from Mary Himes. And this is, I think, the crystal ball question. So Donald Trump has for many years skated free of any consequences from the law or elsewise. How has he done that? Evil genius, flaws in the laws? Which case will finally put him in jail?
I'll give a couple thoughts, and Donald also, if you have thoughts. I think one of the things that Donald Trump was a master of is realizing that if you chose not to credit the system, that it could be hard to reach somebody. In other words, that that in the past, when somebody got subpoenaed by Congress, they came and they testified. If somebody was that if there was a grand jury investigation, people went in and testified. Donald Trump started with the kind of the view of, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to accept, so none of my people are going to go into Congress. You have to come, go to court and try to compel us, and we're going to fight that, and that's going to take years, and it's never going to get anywhere. And similarly, when there are Hatch Act violations, we're just not going to punish anybody. And and sort of with when grand juries um, subpoena banks, they're going to go to court to stop the banks from fulfilling those subpoenas. This idea that like we just don't buy into any of it and we're not going to do it. And it turns out that that is a shockingly effective strategy. And one of the things that we need to do now is unfortunately not assume good faith on anybody's part, and change the laws and change the enforcement mechanisms so that there are ways to force investigations forward over resistance. It's never going to be perfect, but it can be a whole lot better than it is. All of that said, Donald Trump's ability to just ignore laws and rules gets much, much less when he is not in office anymore. And I think he's going to have a tough time with the Manhattan DA. I don't know if there's going to be a federal investigation that gets to him, but maybe after last week's events, there will. But some of these state investigations, I think the thing that may hurt Donald Trump more than anything else is the thing that I wrote about today, which is his pocketbook. That his businesses were already tremendously leveraged and in some cases not in great shape. And what I think he was counting on was coming out of office and just making a ton of money by all of these people and corporations and Republican organizations and things that wanted a piece of him. And if that all goes away, and we're going to push like hell and make sure that all goes away, he could be facing $400 million in debt that comes due with no way to pay for it. And that's a consequence. Donald, I don't know if you have something to add on that.
Well, I'm certainly biased towards our complaint in Georgia, but I agree with you. My very first internship was with the Manhattan DA's office. I think he has put too big of a target on his back. He can't pardon himself out of those investigations, and I think that he's also lost a lot of goodwill with folks, certainly in New York, and I think the sycophants that could have protected him. And I think you can't pressure, even if he doesn't pardon himself, you can't pressure the Manhattan DA's office in the same way that he could pressure the Justice Department and the Biden administration to let him skate. And then I think the other thing that can't be underestimated, quite frankly, is without the presidency and without Twitter, what power does he actually wield, right? Like, how does he do what he did this past week and send all of his loyalists to New York to threaten the Manhattan DA or send them to threaten Letitia James? I think he's wounded now, and I think one of those investigations at the state level will get him.
Well, on that happy note, I want to thank you. And Sue Mandel has a few closing words.
Yep, just I echoed the thanks. I think we are about to enter a new era of ethics and responsibility in Washington, but I know that you guys will be there to make sure we enter that new era, and we'll also take care of everything that's gone on in the past. So thank you so much, everybody. Please follow Crew's work. Please support them if you're so inclined. And we are so appreciative that you are there doing all this work. So thanks, everybody. See you next time.